In this short video, I am going to discuss how we got the Bible we have. So, the big question is, this is a book that has been put together over 1,500 years. Who says what goes in it and what doesn't? As I have discussed previously, there is an Old Testament and a New Testament. And we're going to talk about the New Testament first, and you'll see why in just a minute. Um, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew largely, the New Testament in Greek. So let's go ahead and talk about the New Testament. 27 books or books and letters: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, the book of Acts, and the following letters. Now, I'm only going to talk about this a little bit because, quite frankly, there are people that spend their lives on this. There are books that talk about it in just talks about the New Testament itself. When we put the New Testament together, we call that the New Testament Canon. So how did we get it? It's not like somebody put a stamp on it when they wrote it and said, this is official, and this is inspired by God. So how did we get it? Well, the most of the letters are written by Paul the apostle, and there are things that authenticate those, but we'll discuss that a little further in a minute. Most of them are letters, and the church, after the apostles died, they brought leaders in certain cities. For instance, Clement the First was called the Bishop of Rome. He was the leader of the church in Rome. Polycarp was a leader of the church, and these were direct disciples of some of the apostles, like John and Peter, and they wrote letters to one another. And sometimes they sent a book to one another. At any rate, the Gospels were largely accepted and talked about in their letters, in their churches, and so there's an authenticity to them. The letters themselves also were passed around from church to church, and they talked about them with each other. These are called the church fathers. How did they handle the letters that we now call scripture? And how were they put together? They weren't actually put together as a whole until in the fourth century. Now, there was a council at Hippo, which happened in 393, and there was one at Carthage that happened in 397. Now, those councils were put together of bishops and leaders of the churches at that time, and they discussed how they needed to have one final put together book, if you will, put together canon of Scripture. That what is the church recognizing as official, so that false letters don't come in with uninspired words, non-truths, and they were out there. There were letters being put out by people that were not written by Paul, but they may have been signed by Paul or things like that. So these councils were putting together the books. Now, there were three basic tests. The first test was it written by an apostle? And is there evidence that it was written by the apostle themselves? And that is the first test. The second test is what those letters talked about. Did it talk about the doctrine of the church, accepted doctrine as it was being used in the church, as it was viewed by the church, in agreement with Old Testament doctrine that had been used? So how was it used? And the third test, and I consider this very important, was how did the early church fathers treat it? Now, that means we have letters from other people. And one of those letters in 367 was by Anastasius. And Anastasius wrote to other bishops, and he included a list. And in that list were all 27 books that we now recognize. That was in 367. And he was talking about this list that everybody had been using, that the leaders had been using. Irenaeus is another early church father before that who also wrote about how these books were being used. And even earlier than that, we have letters from different leaders that talked about some of the books, and then others talked about others, and they were still putting all of that together. The Council of Carthage recognized that, and these 27 passed this test, and so were put together in this canon. And now, what about the Old Testament? So that's the New Testament written in Greek. What about the Old Testament? Well, there are several things to say about the Old Testament. First, uh, the Hebrew scriptures, as they were written, as they are put together, is largely what Jesus used. When he quotes, he often quotes from the translations of the Hebrew then or the Hebrew itself, and so that lends credibility. The other thing is that the 27 in those 27 books of the New Testament, all of the Old Testament books except for three are either directly quoted or definitely talked about implied. Now those three are Esther, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Those are the three not talked about within the pages of the New Testament, but largely accepted during the time of Jesus. So that lends itself credibility to the entire Old Testament. That was already put together. It's what Jesus was using himself. He did not reject any of that Old Testament, so we rely upon the Old Testament. Now, um, and how is it preserved? Well, first of all, let me just say that archaeology backs up the Bible as being authentically preserved. And I want you to think about this. In 380 BC, before Jesus was born, 380 years before the birth of Jesus, Plato wrote the Republic. No one doubts the authenticity of that. It is not as well preserved as the Bible is, and yet it is received as authentic. So, and that's 400 years before. So that archaeology supports the New Testament canon and the Old Testament canon. And furthermore, in 1947, a discovery was made, and that discovery is called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were uncovered archaeologically in a cave. And those scrolls were said to date way back before the birth of Christ, and they are the same as the translations we now have. Those words are preserved the same. One of the biggest discoveries in the 20th century. I want to read a verse as well. How is it preserved? Well, God, who inspired it, is certainly able to preserve it. From the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, chapter 55, and starting at verse 10, as the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish, so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. So through Isaiah the prophet, God is saying, I will accomplish what I sent my word to do. So he has preserved it and certainly has the ability to preserve it. If you want more on this subject, there's plenty. I'm going to put a resource or two in the comments below. So you can look there. You can find whole books on this. Look it up on the internet. How did we get our New Testament canon? And if you want to find out more about the Old Testament canon, feel free to do the same on that. Okay?